I also decided that I probably didn't have time to talk about Boiardo, Tasso, and Ariosto, and so have cut it down to one of these very large epic romances. So Orlando is the eponymous hero of Ludovico Ariosto's 16th century epic romance Orlando Furioso, and he has impenetrable skin like Achilles. So does one of the Saracen heroes, Pharaoh. They, like Achilles, do have a vulnerable point, the soles of Orlando's feet and Pharaoh's belly button, but for the most part, they are impenetrable. In spite of this relative invulnerability, both Orlando and Pharaoh have the custom of going about almost continuously armed. As the 12th canto 49th stanza notes, e l'uno e l'altro ando più per annato che per bisogno alle sue imprese amato. Or, and the one and the other went about his business armed more for decoration than for need. The word ornato provides the key reason for the armor, and it is not need or practicality, but armor's status as ornament or decoration. The word ornament etymologically derives from the Latin words ornamentum and ornatus. Wayne Rubhorn and Frank Wigham, in a note to George Putnam's 1589, The Art of English Poesy, expand on this linkage in their note to the third book of Putnam's rhetorical treatise, which is titled Of Ornament. Quote, the Latin word ornamentum meant the equipment of a soldier, his arms. It later acquired the meaning of the accoutrements of a profession, such as the clothing of an actor, and even later, that of mere decoration. The related term ornatus also means the rhetorical figures and tropes that ornament oratory or writing. Therefore, directly related to ornament is the decorous, particularly via adhering to decorum in all things, from decorative appearance to behavior. In fact, disrupting rhetorical, behavioral, or sartorial stylistic conventions could challenge the entire socio-political system. As important as any utilitarian function of armor, then, is the work that it does to ornament and situate the wearer in relation to a larger socio-political system. This is particularly true in regard to the way that ornamented armor helps define ideal martial masculinity. In her study of Italian armor in the Renaissance, Carolyn Springer makes the claim that decorative effects on armor by master armorers like the Negrolis, quote, greatly enhanced their value as instruments of rhetoric, end quote. Building on Springer, I will consider how ornamentation on armor works as a semiotic code to make legible an idealized martial masculinity that inevitably collapses on itself. In this paper, I will argue that both for the largely invulnerable Orlando and Pharaoh and the other armored warriors in Ariosto's epic romance, armor is an agent that invests martial masculinity as socially and politically defined. Ornament is the key to displaying martial decorum because it encodes that very system. But even as the ornamented surface marks appropriate martial masculinity in its legibility, the possibility of misinterpretation undermines the stability of ornamented armor as a material code for reading martial masculinity, at times with deadly consequences. Ultimately, even the best martial characters fall short of idealized martial masculinity. Armor serves as a prosthesis to bridge the distance, but this prosthesis paradoxically marks the absence of ideal instantiations of the masculine martial body, even as it substitutes for that lack through its very physical presence, and by occasionally constructing a masculine martial lineage. This relationship plays out in the pages of Orlando Furioso, but the textual play invokes the very real material risks incumbent upon 16th century men who used ornamented armor as a material marker of their privileged martial masculinity. As such, the agency of armor in the pages of romance is enmeshed in the material struggle to define, display, and most importantly, evolve martial masculinity in the 16th century. First, ornamented armor is often mentioned but rarely given explicit description in the Orlando Furioso. There are only two instances of jewel-encrusted armor, and they represent the two extremes of ornament's legibility as a marker of martial masculinity. The first instance is the witch Eriphila's armor. We encounter her fairly early on in the romance when Alcina seduces Ruggiero and takes him to her lands. Ruggiero is a Saracen destined to convert to Christianity, marry the lady knight Bradamante, and become an ancestor of the Este family of Ferrara, for whom Ariosto worked. And he is one of the most idealized warriors in the romance. In the first description of Eriphila's armor, the word ornato again plays an important role. From the 6th canto, 81st stanza, e di smeraldo ornata e di zaffiro sull'arme d'or, and the gold armor was ornamented with emeralds and sapphires. The next canto continues the encounter and provides a longer description of the armor. Quell'era armata del più fin metallo, c'avian du più colore gemme distinto, ruben vermiglio, crisolito giallo, verde smeraldo con flavo giacinto. Or she was armed with armor of the finest metal that had gems of various colors, red rubies, yellow topaz, green emeralds, and with golden-colored amethysts. Erafila's behavior, however, is not decorous, and she's quickly defeated by Ruggiero, even though he's identified as weak at this point due to his moral failure with Alcina. The next instance of explicitly jewel-encrusted armor belonged to the Trojan hero Hector. It is described in the 38th canto, 78th stanza, as ricche di gioie e ben fregiate d'oro, or rich in jewels and well adorned or embellished with gold. I will discuss Hector's armor in more detail shortly, but the point I want to make here is that Hector's armor is regularly identified as the quintessential marker of martial masculinity. His ironically absent body is the expression of ideal masculinity in the text. These two instances of specifically jeweled armor identify the inherent risk of ornament as a semantic code for reading martial masculinity. Aside from being female, Erafila's behavior is hardly decorous, as would be expected by a reading of her armor. On the other hand, the absent Hector and his armor mark the epitome of martial decorum, even though we are missing an actual warrior's body. This reveals the fraught interpretive space of ornamented armor as a semiotic code for masculinity. Keeping in mind the instability of ornamented armor as a rhetorical marker, I want to now turn to the ease and stakes of misinterpretation of this ornamented armor. The wizard Atlante, or Atlas, repeatedly depends upon misinterpretation of armor and martial display to try to project Ruggiero from ultimately dying. In one instance in the 4th canto, he rides a hippogriff and captures knights and ladies to keep Ruggiero company in a protected castle. Bradamante comes to rescue her beloved Ruggiero and at first interprets Atlante as a fierce warrior because of his armor, weapons, and winged steed. But when she gets a magic ring that cuts through illusion, she realizes that even though che sembra a uomo feroce, he seems like a warlike man, he actually relies on misreading of his display to avoid combat. Aided by the ring that cuts through his rhetorical and decorative performance, she easily defeats him and frees Ruggiero. Another instance of misrecognition with higher stakes occurs when the knight Grifone has his armors taken. Grifone loves a disloyal woman, or a gile, who finds a new lover, Martano, while Grifone is away. Grifone eventually finds them, and they tell him that Martano is her brother. The 16th canto, 2nd stanza tells us that Martano, con molto pompa armato, or is armed with splendid array. So Grifone assumes he is an honorable knight because of his interpretation of Martano's armored appearance. They travel to a tournament where Martano shames himself by avoiding combat and then running away, and Grifone distinguishes himself as the best knight there. Grifone leaves to catch up with the other two at an inn, and they make excuses for Martano. Grifone takes a nap, and while he's sleeping, Martano and Orgile steal his armor and horse and return to claim Grifone's reward at the tournament. Now, Grifone, left naked after the theft, decides to wear Martano's armor, which is a bad idea because when he shows up, they think he's the former coward Martano. They strip the armor from him, pull him around on a cart, and drag the armor behind it in the dirt. He eventually loses control and kills a whole bunch of people, but the treatment of his shame at the particular moment focuses also on the armor as marking his identity as the former coward. Even his twin brother Aquilante at first misrecognizes Martano for Grifone because of his reading of the armor that Martano wears. In fact, when Martano takes Grifone's armor, the text indicates that he takes the armor and goes to the king in the pel cavaliero, or in the skin or the place of the knight. The literalization of Martano's assumption of Grifone's identity further clarifies the stakes of misreading armor. Not only does Grifone receive maltreatment because he's interpreted as the coward Martano, but he loses a critical piece of his identity, a piece as integral as his own skin. The targeting of the armor in his humiliation further reinforces the critical role it plays in the reading of masculinity by viewers. Largely because of this high cost of misinterpretation, the text and the cavalieri are concerned with defending their individual claims to a particular interpretation of their armor or emblems. Again, the stakes of this interpretation can be deadly. But a semiotics of martial masculinity that depends upon the reading of ornamented armor also depends upon conflict, a rhetorical and physical debate to determine the best or most persuasive interpretation. These repeated conflicts over identity markers, however, result in not only the proliferation of pieces of armor, but also the fragmentation of the idealized martial masculine body. I'll look at two examples of this, Orlando's arms and armor and Hector's. Orlando's sword, Durandana, and his helmet are both desired by numerous other warriors. Multiple battles are fought over claims to the helmet and sword in particular, and Rinaldo even challenges and eventually kills the Saracen Dardinello for wearing the same emblem as Orlando. He sees this as Dardinello usurping Orlando's, this is my interpretation of the scene, martial masculine identity by wearing the same emblems. He says only Orlando has the right to wear the emblems. This copying decreases the individuality of each wearer, thereby eroding the original wearer's claim to ideal martial masculinity. When Orlando goes insane, he scatters the pieces of his armor all over the woods. The pieces of his armor become trophies for collection and ownership in an effort to construct a particular identity. His friends Zerbino and Isabella find the pieces of scattered armor, gather them together, and hang them in a tree. As the 57th stanza of the 24th canto notes, come un bel trofeo, or like a fine trophy. Mandricardo, a Saracen knight who has fought with Orlando before over a claim to the sword, shows up to claim the sword. Zerbino fights him to prevent the fragmentation of this trophy, but Mandricardo defeats him and Zerbino dies of his wounds. Similar to the ongoing dispute over Orlando's arms and armor, Mandricardo and Ruggiero fight over the Trojan knight Hector's arms and armor. They fight several times over this armor specifically noted to be 1,000 years old, and Hector's emblem of the white eagle. Eventually, Ruggiero defeats and kills Mandricardo and takes part of Hector's armor, dispersing the rest of it among high members of the Saracen force. The trophy nature of the armor, as well as its age, identifying it as classical, resonate with the popular trophy motif used in Italian-style armor in the 16th century. We've seen some examples of that. I'll show you a few more. While Ariosto's text predates the examples I will show you by several decades, the style was popular throughout the 16th century. And I find that the progression of this popularity over this century supports my claim that martial masculinity is evolving over the 16th century, partially in reaction to the issues of legibility and lack identified in the pages of Ariosto's romance and in other places as well. Okay, so the first is an example of a peascod breastplate. This is from Milan, probably about 1580. And what I wanted to call attention to, as we've already kind of talked about today, so I won't go over it in more detail, is the way that it's mimicking a doublet. It's mimicking a doublet in terms of where the bands are, and inset into the bands is the trophy motif. So you see pieces of armor, also animals from the Mannerist style, but most importantly, pieces of armor. And I don't have a really clear example of one of the cuirasses, but it's often modeled on the all'antica style, so you can see like the anatomical features of the abdomen. This is another example. It was done in England, but it's in the Italian style. It's for probably Sir Philip Sidney's brother-in-law. But again, kind of you can see the inset of where the bands are mimicking doublet decorations, but also the insetting of these trophy pieces throughout. This is on the right pauldron. And that's fine. That's enough of that. But what I wanted to focus on with the idea of the trophy pieces is that these pieces of Orlando's armor that are scattered all over the place are directly called trophies. And so there's a resonance between the way that this decorative style on armor being worn in the 16th century and the way that armor is treated in these very popular epic romances come together. Armor, it's a fabricated non-human object, obviously, whose material existence depends upon resembling the body, even standing in for the body. And so the way that this relationship between the link to the classical past and the link to the body is emphasized in Orlando Furioso, particularly in relation to Hector's armor that's repeatedly noted to be 1,000 years old and a relic of the classical past. The trophies that are won in the text are a result of seizing another knight's armor and taking the pieces away, sometimes because somebody like Orlando has gone crazy and thrown the pieces all over the place, but other times because you challenge and then you win and you get to take the loser's armor. And so you gather around all these pieces of trophies representing your ideal martial status. If you have more, you're obviously a better knight. So we have this kind of martial economy that's functioning in the text. So the fragmentation of the male armored body happens in the decorations that we saw a few examples of, but it also happens in the text literally with the dispersal of various pieces of armor. So the ornamental effect threatens to compromise the fantasy of enclosed masculinity, even as that decorative process itself can compromise the integrity of the steel plate bearing the decoration. The acids used to etch or engrave the steel plate can corrode and weaken the steel, but these decorations are central to the functionality of armor in terms of identity, construction, and power display. A significant component of armor's materiality comes from its ornamented surface. The decoration that provides much of armor's texture suggests a deep interpenetration of surface and depth, an essentially prosthetic relation between steel plate and surface ornament. Both in the trophy motif on material armor and in the proliferation of pieces of armor as trophies in the pages of Orlando Furioso, ornamented armor offers itself as a prosthesis that promises to mask the fragmented or imperfect body with the appearance of ideal martial masculinity. When armor is left, a stationary person in armor looks rather like a propped or empty suit of armor. Is there really anyone in there? Is always a question that can be asked until you see movement. Consequently, armor immediately implicates the questionably present body in a material sense. This is especially true in the pursuit of ideal martial masculinity in Orlando Furioso. Hector is 1,000 years dead, and his absence is made more obvious by the ongoing presence of his much fought-over armor. In spite of that lack, however, his armor exerts agency on its wearers, making their claims to that armor even more important in the martial economy of Orlando Furioso. Early modern humoral theory held that the body excreted refined humors that became the outer layer of the skin, hair, sweat, or even more rarefied vapors that could penetrate both bodies and objects. Organic objects were similarly composed of humors, but inorganic objects could absorb these humoral products. In effect, then, Hector's arms and armor infuse its wearers, most notably Orlando, Ruggiero, and Mangiacardo, with Hector's own ideal martial essence. Wearing Hector's ideal armor injects the warriors with a little bit of Hector's idealized masculinity. And this dynasty is not just that of a metaphorical warrior son receiving the visible marker of his warrior father's profession. It is a dynasty made familial through the interpenetration of humoral residues via the medium of the steel armor. Armor most serves as prosthesis in this interpenetration, enabling the linkage of present, imperfect, lacking warriors to the idealized martial masculinity of the classical past. Yet this prosthetic relationship ultimately breaks down, even as the semiotic code of ornamented armor for reading martial masculinity runs into problems with legibility. Orlando goes insane, and his previously unified suit of armor is scattered. Ruggiero does conquer Mangiacardo and lay claim to Hector's arms, but he dies shortly after fathering a child, and is later revenged by his wife Bradamante and his warrior twin sister Marfisa. Even the paragon of masculinity, Hector, faced defeat by Achilles and was ignominiously dragged behind Achilles' chariot. The failure of the prosthetic encounter models that of many contemporary readers who used ornamented armor as part of their identity construction. As Springer shows in her book Armor and Masculinity in the Italian Renaissance, many instances of using highly ornamented suits of armor to assert particular claims to masculine expression failed due to dynastic pressures, physical limitations, or consequences of transgressing socio-political codes of decorum. In spite of inevitable failures of legibility or idealized displays of martial masculinity, however, Ariosto also depicts his heroes, male and female alike, negotiating gendered codes for behavior and decorative display in creative ways that challenge the very assumption that idealized masculinity is either attainable or desirable. Ruggiero does end up getting the girl, so to speak, when Bradamante's parents arrange a marriage between her and the son of the king of Greece. But the figure of Prince Leon, that son, offers an alternative view of masculinity. Ruggiero becomes indebted to Leon, who saves his life by breaking him out of prison. Ruggiero promises to help him however he can, so Leon asks him to defeat Bradamante so that Bradamante can be Leon's wife. she has set a challenge backed by Charlemagne that she will only marry a man who can defeat her in arms. Leon, not knowing of Ruggiero and Bradamante's relationship, knows he cannot defeat Bradamante himself and asks Ruggiero to fight in his place. Ruggiero wins, and when he and Leon go before King Charlemagne, Ruggiero is armed. Leon is quite different. As the 53rd stanza of the 46th and last canto describes, con ricche vesti ed regalmente ornato Leon senza arme, or Leon unarmed with rich clothes and regally adorned. The reappearance of ornato at the close of the romance marks an alternative expression of masculinity, one dependent upon rhetorical skill, empathy, kindness, and generosity, all traits associated with Leon that he displays. When Leon learns of the mutual love of Ruggiero and Bradamante, he steps aside for them to wed. During the 16th century, when feats of arms by knights became increasingly rare and outdated, this figure of decorous masculinity comes to replace martial masculinity, even as it absorbs the external markers of that masculinity in portraiture that depicts men like Leon in armor, even if they never really wore or used it very often. In this short paper, I've sought to show how armor in Ariosto's romance has an agency to invest martial masculinity on its wearers. Encoded on the decorative surface is a semiotic code for making masculinity legible, but even the best martial characters fail to meet the ideal. In these cases, the armor serves as a prosthesis, pulling together the trophy pieces, literally on material armor through the trophy motif, and in the text through combats to win particular pieces of other people's armor. This constructs a substitute for any difference between real and ideal. The inevitable misinterpretation from reading masculinity on ornamented armor parallels the inevitable failure of the warrior to always be the ideal, even aided by armor imbued with the essence of the heroes of the past. In a century marked by the increasing irrelevance of chivalric display on the battlefield and the turn to armor as a tool for identity construction, this marks an evolution of masculinity, an evolution suggested by the figure of the rhetorically gifted, conspicuously unarmed Leon. Thank you.